The saying that we often attribute to Ben Franklin comes from a letter, but it's not actually. We have record of the saying going back to about 1716, not by Franklin. But in a letter he wrote that there are only two things in life that are certain, being death and taxes. And I'm not up here this morning to talk to you about taxes. Death is the end of all men. There is no more simple way to put it. At some point, this life will be done, will be finished. And that is a fact that isn't unique to us. In other words, it's not just Americans who have dealt with death. Death was a known subject even back in the days of Christ. The story of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus gives in Luke 16, beginning in verse 19, is one of the saddest stories in all of the Bible. As we look through that story, we see some things. There was a rich man, it says in verse 19, who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. Reading from the New King James. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And so it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. And then, so there are some things that we see. First of all, we see life, and we see two different circumstances of life. The rich man, it said, was clothed in purple. That was an expensive colored dye. It wasn't easy to make purple clothing, and so it tended to be expensive. And so the Lord describes the rich man in expensive terms. He wore purple. He wore linen. He fared sumptuously. There was no lack at his table. And then we have Lazarus. Lazarus, it says, was a poor man. He was a beggar. He was not well medically. His body was full of sores. He was weak. He was so poor that people brought him and sat him at the man's gate, where he hoped just to be fed, not even with the leftovers, it says the crumbs that came from the rich man's table. And he was so weak, it says that the dogs came and licked those sores. He couldn't even fend off the animals. Lazarus died, and you'll notice it says he was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. What it doesn't tell us is that he was buried. He was a man isolated and alone in life. When the end of his life came, there's no indication that there was anyone who mourned his death. The rich man, on the other hand, it says about him that he died and was buried. So I think there's a reason why Jesus points out that the rich man was buried and doesn't say anything about Lazarus. But you'll also notice that there's a state afterwards. Lazarus was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man lifted up his eyes from torment. In verse 27, after being told that there is no way for him to cross from where he was to where Lazarus is, he says, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him, Lazarus, that you would send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Now, we all are familiar with the story and how Abraham tells him that that's not possible. And he points out that if he wouldn't listen to Abraham and the prophets, which they already had, they're not even going to listen to one who comes back from the dead. But I would suggest to you that this story tells us that there are some things that the dead want you to know. This was a man who had died. He found himself in a place that he did not want to go. And he said, there are some things that my brothers need to know. There are some things that the dead want you to know. The first of these, I think, is to take heed to the idea that your soul is the most important thing that you have. What is a fair exchange for a soul? We live in a world that is very commercially driven. We talk about contracts, and we want contracts to be fair. We don't like to see contracts that aren't fair. We don't like to see people bargaining from a place of power against one who has none at all. And so we love the idea of fairness and equity. When we think about our soul, what is a good exchange for that soul? What is worth it? In Matthew 16, we have another story that is given. In Matthew 16, Jesus asked the question, in telling his disciples to take up their crosses and follow after him, he says, for what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what would a man give in exchange for his soul? What do you think the rich man would have given? The rich man had many worldly possessions. He dressed in expensive clothes. He ate expensive food. His house was large enough that he had to have a gate, which is where they put Lazarus. Do you think the rich man, looking back, would have given up all those worldly possessions in order to find himself in different circumstances than where he found himself eventually? In Luke 12, we have the story of the rich fool. In verse 13, of course, a man had come to Jesus and said, Teacher, tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me. And it's entirely possible that the man may have been owed something, and his brother selfishly had kept it all. Or it may have been he just didn't like the fact that his brother got more than he did. The Lord, in fact, kind of points to that second one as he says to beware of covetousness. In verse 16, he gives a story of a rich man. He says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully, and he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I'll do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods, and I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? Here's a man, he had a lot of stuff. We don't even necessarily know that he was rich to start with. It just says he was a certain man. He comes into some wealth. His crops yielded bountifully one year, apparently great bounty. And he plans to retire on it. But at the end of the day, God said to him, This night your soul will be required of you. Do you think that man would have given up his worldly possessions? When we look back again at the story of the rich man and Lazarus, we don't ever actually see any interaction between the rich man and Lazarus. I have no doubt that the rich man knew that Lazarus was at his gate. He knew what Lazarus was wanting, and he did nothing about it. What do you think? How about kindness? Would it be worth your soul to show some kindness or generosity? The rich man had lots. He could have given something to Lazarus, and according to the scripture, it doesn't sound like it would have cost him that much. You know, David had committed sin. And when I say that, all of your minds, I'm sure, immediately turn to Bathsheba, but that was not the only sin that he committed in his life. There was another incident in which he told Joab to go out and number the people, and Joab, for all of his faults, Joab tried to talk him out of it and told him this was not a thing you ought to do. And sure enough, as a result of it, as a result of David doing what he wasn't supposed to do, God ended up sending the destroyer through the land. Finally, the destroyer came and stopped the land of a certain man. David heard about it, and he hurries out, and he is going to offer sacrifices there where the angel is stopped. And that man, and I'm sure it was from the goodness of his heart and probably the fear that he had from seeing the angel on his land, offered to give David anything he needed. The animals, the wood, the stone from the threshing floor where this was happening. He was just going to give it all to David. And David, bless his heart, said, I will not offer and sacrifice that which cost me nothing. I bring that up because what we have with the rich man and Lazarus is a situation where the man apparently could have given up quite a bit to Lazarus without actually having sacrificed anything. It doesn't sound like it would have hurt the man to let Lazarus come and eat at his table, to give him his old clothes, whatever. The generosity that the man could have shown and chose not to. You think, looking back, he wished that he would have done that and thought maybe that would be a good exchange for my soul? Our soul is the most important thing we have, because here is the truth. We will leave the world with what we brought into it. And if you think about what that means, we all came into the world the same way. Doesn't matter who your mother was. Doesn't matter whether you were born through a C-section or whether you came in through what we would refer to as the more natural way. We all came into the world the same way. Naked. We all brought with us nothing. When you came into this world, you had nothing, really including the breath in your lungs, because what was the very first thing that you did when you came out? You took a breath and began to cry. When we leave, we will leave with what we brought into this world. In Ecclesiastes 5, Ecclesiastes 5 in verse 15. The preacher says, "As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. He shall take nothing from his labor which he may carry away in his hand." In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 7. Paul, by inspiration, says, "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out." I would imagine that one of the things that the rich man wanted his brothers to know was that they have nothing more important than their souls. Because when they leave this life, they leave it taking with them what they brought. And all of the work that they did, all of the riches that they amassed, even all of the friends that they made, they cannot take with them. I think it's also important to note that death can come suddenly. Those who die tragically and their families know this. No one is ready for death when it happens to those near them. No one is ready for that moment. And anyone who tells you they are probably isn't telling all of the truth. I still remember when my father passed in 2019. I remember my mother calling and saying, "We were going to remove life support from him. You should come." Which means I knew the moment he was going to leave. Well, not the moment, but I knew the day. And as Carol and I got into the car that morning, I told her, "I'm not ready for this." In Psalm 103, in the 103rd Psalm, verses 15 and 16. The sweet singer of Israel says, "For as for man, his days are like grass. As the flower of the field, so he flourishes. For the wind passes over it and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more." You know, there's perhaps nothing that drives that home more than a hospital room. When my dad passed, they left his body in there for some time. But you know, we escorted the body out at the end of the day. And by the next morning, there was someone else in that room. That room didn't remember him. There was no plaque putting up saying that Riley Chandler died in this place. In James 4 and verse 14, James reminds us that our lives are like a vapor. They're there for a very short time and they vanish away. Death comes suddenly. We never know the exact moment of its arrival. And as we look more closely at the story of the rich man in Luke 12, we see that he suffered really, I think, from the misconception that at some point all men have concerning death. It won't happen to me. Back in Luke 12, we have the rich man. He thought within himself, what am I going to do since I have no room to store my crops? And the actions that he exhibits make it apparent that he thought everything was well with his soul. I know what I'll do. I'll pull down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And I'll say to my soul, soul, we have many goods laid up for many years. It's all going to be great. It's all coming up roses from here on out. He thought that death was something that only happens to someone else. He gave no thought to what he could do with those goods, other than store them up so that he would have many years' worth of labor that is saved because he didn't have to work it anymore. And yet that night, he died. His soul was required of him. In Genesis 27, we have the statement of Jacob that is made concerning his own life. Genesis 27 in verse 2. Jacob called Esau before him and he said, behold, now I am old. I do not know the day of my death. We don't know when our time is going to come. In Ecclesiastes 9, the preacher points out again that time and chance happen to everyone. Ecclesiastes 9, in verse 11, he says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. For man also does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. So I imagine that after telling his brothers that their souls were the most important things they had, the rich man also wanted his brothers to know that death could come for them suddenly. But they may not know the moment when it's going to occur. And then we have to understand that with physical death comes a transition. Death is always a separation in the Bible. Physical death, we have the separation of the body and the spirit. Spiritual death, we have the separation of the spirit from God. In Luke 16, shows us that following death, we will find one of two fates. In Luke 16, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom. He goes to a place of rest. He goes to a place that we might call paradise. The rich man, on the other hand, lifted up his eyes from torment. His end after death was not the same as Lazarus's. Following death, we'll find one of two fates. And I know lots of people say, well, this is just a parable. And others say, well, no, this is a story that actually happened. And here's ultimately, I think it doesn't make any difference for our purposes. If it's a story of something that actually happened, well, then it's a story of something that actually happened. We could draw lessons from it. If it's a parable, the idea of a parable is that you cast something alongside something else so that you may learn from it. The parable of the sower makes sense to us because Jesus takes something that they were familiar with, the sowing of seed, and draws conclusions from it. That story gave them important information so that they could draw spiritual truths from it. And if this is a parable, then the factors within it have to remain true. Otherwise, we can't draw lessons from it. Following death, we'll find ourselves having met one of two fates. Death doesn't have to be a bad thing. In the 116th Psalm, verse 15, the psalmist says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints." In Revelation 14 and verse 13, we have John being told that he needs to write down and reveal. Revelation 14 and verse 13. "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them." Death doesn't have to be a bad thing. But I want you to notice in those two passages, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of any person. No, it's the death of His saints. Blessed are the dead who die in any state. No, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. We can't expect God to consider our passing from this life to be good if we've rejected Him and His Word. We should note that He only calls the death blessed if it's the death of the saint. If it's the death of those who die in the Lord. So I think that the brothers of the rich man would have heard from their brother the importance of being a saint when they made the transition from this life to the next. Because one end is better. One thing that I've heard, and I'm sure others have heard it as well, that, well, if I'm baptized, I'm condemning my parents to hell. No one wants to think about the fate of those who have gone on when they have to think of it with sadness. And we can't deny the sadness of this statement. We do, or we should, love our parents. And to lose family is a terrible thing. But I want you to notice something. I want you to understand something. If you don't understand it today, I hope you understand it as you leave here today. You can't do anything about that. Your act of obedience isn't what condemns someone else to eternal torment. Your act of obedience isn't what turns the tide and causes God to put someone else into hell. And this is something that has been known for a really long time. We can go back to the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 18 and verse 4, the Lord says, "The soul that sins, it shall die." And that statement is in the context of sons not being held to account for the sins of their fathers, nor fathers being held to account for the sins of their sons. What someone else does does not justify you, nor does it condemn you. At death, the transition is made and it is not alterable. Usually, when I have heard that statement, that if I'm baptized, I'm condemning my parents to hell, the very first thing that I want to say is, first of all, that's not your role. I'm not the one who condemns someone to hell. That's God's job. That's not my position in this life or in the next one, to be the one who makes the determination about where someone else goes. But I want you to notice, going back to the rich man and Lazarus, what the rich man says. For I have brothers. Have him testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. I want you to understand what that means. You know, oftentimes we think of the rich man there as being wholly selfish. If he had been less selfish, he would not have ended up where he ended up. And that's a true statement. If he had been more the type of person that God wanted him to be, angels would have borne him to Abraham's bosom just as they had done Lazarus. The rich man was selfish. But I want you to notice that finding himself in a place that he could not leave and was not a place that he wanted to be, he gave thought to where his brothers were on the road to going. He loved his brothers enough that he wanted to warn them. The rich man's love resulted in a desire. And if you're one of those folks who says, if I'm baptized, I'm condemning my parents to hell, my question to you is, do they love you? You can't change where they are. You can't change where they've gone. What you've done won't make the difference. But what do they want for you? If they looked up like the rich man and found themselves where they didn't want to be, what do they want for you? Would they rather say, well, we're family and we stick together and at least we're all in hell together? If they loved you, that's not what they would say. They would say, as the rich man did, lest my son, lest my daughter, lest my cousin, my grandchild, whatever the relationship is, lest they also come to this place of torment. Here in a moment, we're going to sing Song of Invitation. His grace reaches me. These should be sobering thoughts to us. Death comes without warning. At the moment of death, we transition from this life to the next, and we can't change it. There's no crossing over from torment to paradise. But there can be a good end. I'm convinced, my friends, that if the dead could speak, that they could come back and tell us what they've learned now that they've gone past this life. These are the things they would tell us. Your soul is the most important thing you have. They would tell us that death can come suddenly, and so it's best for us to be prepared each moment of each day. They would tell us that with death comes transition and it's unalterable. They would tell us it doesn't have to be terrible. So what about you this morning? Do you know the things that the dead want you to know? Are you ready to make that transition today? If you're not, if you look at your life and you see that if the rich man were able to send Lazarus to talk to you, would it be to warn you or to encourage you? If it would be to warn you, you need to do something about that. We have water. We can baptize you this morning so that you'll be ready for that transition. You've been a child of God and you've wandered astray and you haven't been doing what you ought to have been doing. We'd be happy to pray with you and for you. If you know what the gospel asks you to do, so the good news for you might be that when this life is over and that transition occurs, you end up where you want to go. Then won't you let us help you this morning?
I will praise you with all